And there we go. So it's 1:30. I'm going to start it. We made it to session 6, the final session, and it's looking at the Renaissance and Reformation period. And they're really, I know historians like to talk about each as a separate topic, but they're really two sides of the same universe. But we'll be looking at elements from the humanist revival of the Renaissance and the religious sensibility of the period, which lent itself to mysticism, which we've been looking at on and off through everything that we've been considering so far. In this first slide, just to create a context, we're really talking about, I'd say 1400 to 1600. We're really, the Renaissance arguably begins a little earlier, and very arguably, you could say that, or suggest that there are elements into the 17th century. The two sources for what we normally associate with Renaissance culture are secular humanism, by which I mean mastery of classical Greek, which had been lost in Europe, in the West for centuries, and was re-imported through Byzantium, and we'll talk about how that occurs. But many of the books that were originally Greek got to the West earlier than the Renaissance, but they got to the West in other languages. They came via largely via Arabic, which was then translated into Latin in the 11th and 12th centuries. And this is how people got their hands on the bulk of Plato, the bulk of Aristotle. But there was a passion among the humanists, the Italian humanists of the 14th century and the early 15th century, to get the originals, to get their hands on the originals, to learn the languages that the originals were written in, and to master them so that they could really imbue themselves with the classical sensibility. So they import Greek books, and they give what we would consider a classical education, a humanist education, based on Roman and Greek models of elites. Obviously, the only people undergoing this transformation were people in the nobility, or people who had access to sponsorship by the nobility. So if as one input you take that entire box, secular humanism, and then you pair it with the box on the right, the dissemination of text. It's a period of manuscript hunting to find lost manuscripts, which they found in many of the monasteries, including monasteries as far afield as Ireland, as Germany, as Poland, and obviously all the Italian monasteries. Wherever there would have been a medieval scriptorium, often you had monks copying things that they themselves couldn't understand for the Latin sources. But with the import of Greek texts, these could also now be copied, translated and copied, or not translated, simply copied. But in 1415, right in the middle of the early part of the Renaissance, Gutenberg and the printing press gets developed. And so books that are called, up until 1500, the printed texts are called incunabula. Books support the dissemination of all these new forms of Greek translations or of actual Greek books. Type fonts like italic are created in this period using movable type. And so there's a real affordability of access. And letters among the Italian humanists, not just the Italian humanists, but the Dutch and the French and German humanists, just abound with information about who got their hands on what text. I finally was able to get a copy of Thus and Such. Who would have believed it in this modern world? I could get a copy of the Odes of Catullus, for instance. These two elements, humanism and access to text, produce a paradigm shift that includes the abandonment of what had been university philosophy, scholasticism, which was seen as stodgy and obsessed with theological topics and arcane philosophical topics, and now could be jettisoned for literary sources. The humanists were big on Roman and Greek high literature. Let's read Cicero. Let's read Virgil. Let's read Plutarch rather than arcane discourses on Aristotle and the number of angels that could fit on the head of a pin, which of course led to a questioning of church authority, since the values that were being represented in the classical texts were classical values, which were largely humanist values based on the civilization that we've been looking at through the first sessions of this course. Hellenistic society created the curriculum that was now being consumed. What did this lead to? Well, on the two lower boxes. On one side, a revival of what I called ancient arcana, since we've been calling it arcane and hidden knowledge sources up through this whole series. So Platonism and Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, the Corpus Hermeticus, Gnosticism, all of these were suddenly in play. These were new ways of thinking about the world. They became major topics, and they became lived topics. There were people who just adopted these frameworks as their own, if you will, theological or ethical systems. On the other hand, because classical texts also considered medical, alchemical, astrological, astronomical sources, experimentalism of another kind emerged. An experimentalism that would lead to an interest in the early modern period, about the 17th century, which is really late Renaissance, to what we think of as the reinvention of science, which had suffered badly during the so-called Middle Ages. And so alchemy, astrology, astronomy, these were all topics that led to the kinds of experimentalism that was realized in emerging interest in science. So these were two outcomes of what was going on in the period. And on the next slide, using the same paradigm, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the two sides of a religious revival that was going on at the same time, with different populations in that, or different social classes for the most part, but not always. In Italy, sometimes it was the humanists in the papal court were also part of the Counter-Reformation response to Luther and Calvin in the 16th century. But the inputs there, the upper left box, the criticism of the church that had been going on actually since the Middle Ages, the charge of papal corruption, the objection to church wealth, the vaunted ideal of individual poverty, and particularly poverty of the clergy, coupled again with the dissemination of books. Literacy for the layman. Books weren't suddenly the purview merely of the clergy. because of the printing press, yet again, there was this tremendous affordability of access. Luther, one of his great achievements is translating the Bible into a version of German that was consumable by the entire German-speaking, German literate population, and was responsible for the tremendous rise in literacy rates in the Northern European sphere. This was also true in English because of Protestantism. We know that the Puritans who landed in North America in the early 17th century had a much higher literacy rate than you would have found in any Mediterranean population at the time. Anyhow, another shift in paradigm as the result of these attitudes towards the Roman Catholic Church and the dissemination of literacy and books. And this shift in paradigm had built around the famous three solas of Martin Luther: faith alone, scripture alone, grace alone. Sola fide, sola scriptura, sola gratia. No need for clerical middlemen. Now the layman has a kind of direct access to spirituality and morality without it being mediated by an official representative of this very worldly institution called the church. And there was a personal access to salvation that was intimately personal in a way that the Roman Church hadn't particularly represented itself because of its institutional presence. The result of all this, on the Protestant side, the lower left box, was Protestant sectarianism. So an array of creeds and cults. As soon as the responsibility for interpretation of scripture and tradition drizzles down to laymen or representatives of small laic groups or small groups of the laity, you're going to spawn this immense array of creeds and sects. And because religion in much of Europe, especially in the German-speaking countries, was so identified with the political regimes of wherever it was you found yourself. Germany, it was more fragmented than Italy in a political sense until the 19th century. And so this spawning of creeds and sectarianism meant that political fragmentation and social fragmentation was going to be the result of the development of Protestant sectarianism. And of course, mysticism. Once you offer the layman kind of personal access to the hidden sources, to the magical kingdom, if you will, there's going to be an outcropping of mysticism. On the other hand, Catholic militancy is so aggressive in this period, and this period that sees the invention of the Baroque as a kind of expression of church authority and church glory and church, the church militant, and with the invention of groups like the Jesuits who provide the same role that the Dominicans had in the Middle Ages with the Albigensians that we talked about last time, as a kind of shock troops to be used against the rising threat of Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli and all the German sectarians. And this yields a kind of renewed passion for personal religion on the Catholic side, and mysticism becomes an expression of its revival. So the revival of religion across the board yields interest in mysticism and mystical elements, as we shall see. Now, I want to begin by talking about the Medici for a moment, because they were singularly instrumental in the development of the early Italian Renaissance. Florence was the center already for two generations. By the time we get to the 1430s, for two generations, they had been the center for an interest in all things classical, maybe even three generations. The Council of Florence, it was originally staged in another Italian city, but the Medici brought it to Florence in 1438. It was an attempt in the 1430s to reunite the Roman Catholic or the Latin Church with the Greek Orthodox churches. And it was being pushed strenuously by the Byzantine Empire, which was at this point on its absolute last legs, and in 1453 would finally collapse. By this point, Byzantium was headquartered not even in Constantinople, but in Mistra, a small fortified location in the Peloponnese. And they were making their final appeal for military help from the West. So they used the theological pretext to bring their appeal for military support as well. And they came with a huge entourage. I don't think the patriarch came with them, but other bishops came, ambassadors. And from the Western point of view, most importantly, a series of translators and scholars, Greek scholars. And they were hosted by the Medici and celebrated in this fresco series in the Medici Chapel in the Palazzo Medici. If you've never been there in Florence, this is at the Palazzo Medici. It's right downtown. This is one of the sites to see this fresco. And this is one of the central frescoes, because in it, I'll just blow that up a little bit. In it are all of the Medici family. This is the young heir apparent. We have the older grandfather and father. Every significant attendee of this council is in the painting. And the whole idea is to render the significance of the Medici by making them equal to the cream of the Byzantine crop. Suddenly the Medici are promoting themselves in this so-called journey of the Magi, led by Lorenzo the Magnificent here. They're rendering themselves the equivalent elbow jostling peers of the emperors of the East. And in a sense, they're trying to say, we are going to be the heirs of the old empire here. So several members of the Medici family are here in majestic equivalence. One of the Greek attendees, and he's in here, and I'm going to show his picture on the next slide, was the philosopher and scholar George Gemistos Platon, who's an old guy at this point, and he's got to be at least in his late 70s at this point, who remains in Florence as a teacher of Greek and ancient thought and has a tremendous influence on the Florentine court, because not just because of the texts he brings, because these people traveled with their manuscripts, but because of the content of his thought. As the source of Greek Hermetic and mystical texts He was one of the most important influences on the Italian Renaissance. Here's his picture. He's in that crowd in the previous slide shot. He saw the Greek pantheon, the ancient Greek Olympian gods. What he saw in them was the anthropomorphized reflection of the pure old, the Prisca Theologia, the ancient religion. In other words, remember the theory among the ancients who suspected, as they became sophisticated during the Hellenistic period, they suspected that all the religion that they saw expressing itself around them and these novel syncretic cults that were being imported from Egypt and wherever, they suspected that there really was a true religion under the surface that was achieving expression among the hoi polloi, among the man in the street, and these déclassé, anthropomorphized versions, but that there really was something substantial and secret and valuable underneath it, a pure theology that indeed everybody reached after. And Plato is one. Now in the 15th century, he is someone who shares that sensibility. So applying a Platonic and Neoplatonic framework, he created his own emanationist cosmology with Zeus in the place of Plato's good, or Plotinus's the Tahen, the one. In his world, the universe is eternal, the human soul is immortal, and reincarnated in successive bodies. Come to us, O gods of learning, whoever you may be, in whatever number you may be. It's esoteric. You who preside over science and the truth, who distribute them to whomever you please, according to the decrees of the Almighty Father of all things, King Zeus. Without your help, we would be unable to accomplish such a great work. Come, guide our reasoning and grant this work to obtain the best possible success, and to be like a treasure always open to those people who want to lead the most beautiful and best conduct in public or private life, from a text of his called The Laws. So Zeus is now not the anthropomorphic, thunderbolt throwing Zeus, but it was the name that the Greek world had put onto the high god, which he thought was a valid expression of the Prisca Theologia. Now, following this, I have this quote. It's an account from one of the other Byzantine intellectuals, scholars, translators, who attended the council, a man named George of Trebizond, well known in the Renaissance. And he's talking about Plato. I myself heard him at Florence, asserting that in a few more years, the whole world would accept one and the same religion with one mind, one intelligence, one teaching. And when I asked him, Christ's or Muhammad's, those being, in the eyes of George of Trebizond, the two choices, he said, neither, but it will not differ much from paganism. I was so shocked by these words that I hated him ever after and feared him like a poisonous viper, and I could no longer bear to see or hear him. I heard too from a number of Greeks who escaped here from the Peloponnese that he openly said before he died that not many years after his death, Muhammad and Christ would collapse and the true faith would shine through every region of the globe. If you can imagine the impact this had on young intellectual Italians at the Medici court, one of whom, who was only 5 years old at the time of that council, was Marsilio Ficino, who lived in the Medici household because his patron Cosimo brought him in. Patrons were always looking at bright, promising young men in the followings of the families in the lands that they held. And here was somebody with a real talent for education who was brought in to be the tutor of Lorenzo, Cosimo's grandson. His skill at classical languages and the access to manuscripts afforded by his ideal court placement made him perhaps the most influential humanist philosopher of the 15th century. Among his accomplishments were translations into Latin of the entirety of Plato's extant dialogues, which is no mean work, the works of several Neoplatonists, Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and the entire Corpus Hermetica. So he translated everything he could get his hands on. He established what is sometimes called the Medici Academy, sometimes called Ficino's Academy, using a house and a library donated by the Medici. He establishes this academy on the model of Plato's Academy in Athens. His group of humanist translators and Platonists, some of whom were imports, Greek-speaking imports like Plato, and Plato was there for a while, were not mere antiquarians, but rather true believers in the whole idea of the ancient religion and the superiority of ancient philosophy and religion. This is the period in which the Middle Ages developed its reputation as dark, the Dark Ages. The whole idea among this group of intellectuals was that there was this shining light on the hill that was classicism, and by which they would have meant Hellenistic classicism, both in the Roman Latin-speaking world and in the Greek Eastern Mediterranean, at places like Alexandria, and that because of the German invasions and the loss of political imperial coherence, the collapse of the empire, the German incursions, the loss of language and cultivation that ensued the Germanic invasions, that the rise of the monasteries, Christianity itself being suspect for becoming a kind of aiding and abetting of a worldview that said, let's leave the world now that classicism has collapsed, and develop this kind of fortress world of Christianity that were the monasteries and the churches, and that this was a dark period, which was now being reversed with this return, this rediscovery, this renewal, this renaissance. So a quote from Ficino: "This Plato foretold. He said that a time would come after many generations when the mysteries of theology would be purified by penetrating discussion as gold is purified by fire. This time has come indeed. May the spirit of Plato, we and all his followers rejoice at this exceedingly." And I have this detail from a fresco in the Tornabuoni Chapel of Santa Maria Novella. It's the apparition of the angel to Saint Zachariah, and it's by Domenico Ghirlandaio. And the four figures here are with Ficino on the left. These are humanists, the classicists at the court. So Ficino, Cristoforo Landino, Angelo Poliziano, and they believe, this one's in question, but they believe that it's the Greek scholar Demetrio Calcondila. This is the larger fresco. That detail was from this lower left corner down here, as you can see. And the reason I mention this is to give you a sense of how important the development of the new learning was to the powers that be. Rather than an attack on the universities, here the representatives of high knowledge are being represented along with their patrons and this royal chapel at one of the major churches in town, in what was considered to be really the central city of Italy at this point in time. Anyhow, the Hermetica is something that Ficino opens up as an object of study. Well, now Ficino was a Catholic priest. It was still a way of validating your social position in the world to get ordained. But he skirted orthodoxy with his open regard of all these different religious manifestations that came through the ancient esoteric traditions. And suddenly Hermes Trismegistus is back on the syllabus. Divine providence does not permit any part of the world at any time, this is from the Hermetic itself, to be completely without religion, although it does allow rites to differ. Perhaps variety of this kind is intended. I take it back. This is from Ficino. God prefers to be worshipped in any manner, however unfittingly, than not to be worshipped at all through pride. So we should take Hermes seriously. Here's a woodcut depiction of Hermes. This is Theos, God is in his Shekinah cloud, and here's the great magician with the world at his fingertips. So his interest, Ficino's interest in ancient philosophy, astronomy, alchemy, very naturally led him to the thrice greatest, the Trismegistus, the 3 times master, whose legend made him the original source of the Prisca theology. Remember the old legends? It was, Hermes was thought to be an actual ancient who detailed the central themes of true religion, from which all of the accretions that followed were distortions, but all properly reference some element of the sensibility of the true first principle. The following is from his dedication to Cosimo de' Medici of his translation of the Corpus Hermeticum. So this is in his dedication. They call him Trismegistus, that is thrice greatest, since he was the greatest philosopher, the greatest priest, and the greatest king. He was the first among the philosophers to pass from physics and mathematics to the contemplation of things divine. Remember, microcosm, macrocosm, everything is connected, all studies are connected. Theology, mathematics, and physics are all part of the same examination of the world. He was the first to debate with utmost wisdom the majesty of God, the nature of demons, and mutations of souls. He was therefore called first theologian. Mercurius, that's the Latin version of Hermes. Mercury is the Roman god. Hermes is the Greek name. Mercurius wrote numerous books pertaining to knowledge of the divine, in which, O immortal God, so many secret mysteries, so many astonishing oracles are revealed. And he does not speak only as a philosopher, but often as a prophet, singing the future. He foresaw the ruin of the ancient religion, the birth of the new faith, the advent of Christ, the future judgment, the resurrection of man, the renewal of the world, the glory of the blessed, and the torment of the sinners. So even Christianity is part of the revival promised by Hermes, according to Ficino. Now, the whole idea of the Renaissance man, the humanist appetite for Hermeticism promoted a concept of human dignity and capability that I would argue is at odds with the Christian focus on the frailty of the individual sinner. Oh, somebody asked the question, by the way. I just opened the chat. Hermes is the god. The Hermetica is the teachings that were written down in a book called the Corpus Hermeticum that was received from allegedly a man named Hermes, who was the forerunner of Plato, allegedly, from the right from the 3rd century BC all the way to this point in time. That was the legend of the man. But this Renaissance man was a man, you know how we use the phrase now, as somebody who does many things, a polymath, somebody who's good at several things. But really, as they would have meant it, it was a reflection of the capabilities, the empowerment that the ancient wisdom texts granted the master of all these subjects. So if you look at the Corpus Hermeticum, if you look at Neoplatonism, the master of all these subjects, philosophy, astrology, alchemy, magic, all point to the empowerment of the individual who stands central in the universe as a kind of a god, as we will see in a bit. In a letter to a friend, Ficino waxed enthusiastic about the possibilities opened up by embracing the ancient arts. This century, like a golden age, has restored to light the liberal arts, which were almost extinct, the Dark Ages. Grammar, poetry, rhetoric, painting, sculpture, architecture, music. This century appears to have perfected astrology. And the tone of the age is perfectly expressed in the Corpus Hermeticum itself. So now this is from the ancient text, which would have been both in Greek and in ancient Coptic, because it was discovered in Egypt. So this is the text of the Hermetica. Leap clear of all that is corporeal and make yourself grown to a like expanse with that greatness which is beyond measure. Rise above all time and become eternal. Then you will apprehend God. It's also very Gnostic in its spirit. You are saved already. Just know yourself. Think that for you too nothing is impossible. Deem that you too are immortal, and that you are able to grasp all things in your thought, to know every craft and science. Find your home in the haunts of every living creature. Make yourself higher than all heights and lower than all depths. Think that you are not yet begotten, that you are in the womb, that you are young, that you are old, that you have died, that you are in the world beyond the grave. Grasp in your thought all of this at once, all times and places, all substances and qualities and magnitudes together. Then you can apprehend God. The Renaissance man as this totally empowered figure and the spokesperson for this vision, more than any other, is this what I call here this young nobleman and wunderkind, as I say in the first paragraph, the poster child for Renaissance humanism, syncretism, and hermeticism, was the nobleman and wunderkind Giovanni Pico dei Conti della Mirandola e della Concordia, usually known as Pico della Mirandola, who only lives 31 years. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit here. He got mixed up in the Florentine politics of the period and got a little too close to the famous reforming priest Savonarola, and is thought to have been poisoned when he was only 31 years old, by some offshoots of the Medici family. And I believe, along with another humanist, by the way, and I believe it was about 2007, they actually dug up his remains from whatever crypt, because he was probably in one of the churches, one of the Renaissance churches. And they tested the remains of the bones, and I believe they found arsenic. So he seems to have been poisoned, unfortunately. The Medici giveth and the Medici taketh away. He is a brilliant polymath and linguist. Latin, I mean, besides however many dialects of Italian and French and whatever, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic. He was the student of Plato, Aristotle, the Hermetica, Kabbalah, and Kabbalah he would have needed Hebrew, Aramaic, and God knows whatever of the French or Spanish dialects, some of the Kabbalists that he would have familiarized himself with were speaking at the time. Astrology and ancient magic. He was the epitome of a syncretist. He sort of believed in the validity of all these studies and came up with theories that sort of merge all of them one way or another. Convinced of the absolute validity of the ancient theology, the Prisca theologia, he argued for the underlying agreement of the various religious and philosophical traditions. They're all right. They're all correct. They each, in their own provincial, localist ways, show threads that tie us back to the pure first thought. On the topics of occultism and Kabbalah, in a letter to Ficino, Pico wrote, "Divine providence caused certain books to fall into my hands. They are Chaldean books, meaning from Persia, of Esdras, of Zoroaster, and of Melchior, oracles of the Magi, which contain a brief and dry interpretation of Chaldean philosophy, which is what Zoroastrianism was often described as, but full of mystery." He studied Hebrew with a famous Kabbalist, Elia del Medico, and formally studied Kabbalah for years with an Italian rabbi, Yohanan Alamano, Yohanan the German, whose promotion of magic as the final stage of one's education appealed to Pico's penchant for the mystical and the occult. He was among the first, perhaps the very first, to develop a Christian version of Kabbalah, in which the 10 Sephirot are linked to the Trinity and Christian redemption. According to one scheme, there were various versions of this. One scheme had the upper three Sephira, which I've outlined here in red, which all represent in Judaic Kabbalah the intellectual sphere of God, corresponding to the persons of the Trinity, while an alternate made Keter, the top guy, the Holy Spirit, and Chochmah, the Father, and Bina, Mary. So variously. Oh, and that is a painting from later, the next century, but there are suggestions that Pico has appeared in certain frescoes done by other humanists and group scenes. So like Raffaello, for instance, in the School of Athens, they believe his visage is they're representing one of the ancient philosophers. I don't know, but that's the only portrait we think we have of him. And then he writes the Oration on the Dignity of Man, which has been referred to in scholarly circles as the manifesto of the Renaissance. It's the quintessential expression of Renaissance humanism and its vision of human nature. He follows this pattern. He starts with a question. The question essentially is, what makes man special? Abdallah the Saracen, when questioned as to what on this stage of the world, as it were, could be seen most worthy of wonder, replied, "There is nothing to be seen more wonderful than man." An agreement with this position is the saying of Hermes Trismegistus, "A great miracle, Asclepius, is man." But when I weighed the reasons for these maxims, the many grounds for the excellence of human nature reported by many men failed to satisfy me. Well, so what makes man the most important figure in this panoply? For why should we not admire more the angels themselves and the blessed choirs of heaven? They're around the throne of God all the time. They're higher, purer beings. Why are men important? And then he takes his answer, or he makes his bid for an answer, by forming a kind of creation narrative. He tells the story of creation all over again from another angle. When the work was finished, when God had created in the 6 days the heavens and separated the waters and the light and whatever, and the animals, and the craftsman, God, kept wishing that there was someone to ponder the plan of so great a work, to love its beauty, and to wonder at its vastness. It's incomplete without an audience. He finally took thought concerning the creation of man, but there was not among his archetypes, in other words, his forms, all the things, he created everything that there was to create. Animals, angels, whatever. There was not among his archetypes that from which he could fashion a new offspring. All was now complete. All things had been assigned to the highest, the middle, and the lowest orders. We had inanimate matter, we had plants, we have animals, we have angels. What have I got to create? The great chain of being, the medieval universe, if you will, top to bottom, is complete without humanity. And then he goes on. Man is created as an indeterminate nature with no designated place in the chain, neither animal nor angel, and with no fixed limits. To quote, "He therefore took man as a creature of indeterminate nature, and assigning him to a place in the middle of the world, neither a fixed abode nor a form that is thine alone, nor any function peculiar to thyself, have we given thee, Adam, to the end that according to thy longing and according to thy judgment, thou mayest have and possess what abode and what form and what functions thou thyself shalt desire. The nature of all other beings is limited and constrained within the bounds of laws prescribed by us. Thou, you, constrained by no limits, in accordance with your own free will, in whose hand we have placed thee, shall ordain for thyself the limits of thy nature. We have set thee," this is the human privileged position, "we have set thee at the world's center, that thou mayest from thence more easily observe whatever is in the world." You are the perfect audience. You are indeterminate. You can make of yourself whatever you want to make yourself. We have made thee neither of heaven nor of earth. You're not an angel, you're not an animal, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with freedom of choice and with honor as though the maker and molder of thyself, thou mayest fashion thyself in whatever shape thou shalt prefer. Thou shalt have the power to degenerate into the lower forms of life, which are brutish. Thou shalt have the power out of thy soul's judgment to be reborn into the higher forms, which are divine. Perfectly consonant with the Neoplatonic vision of rising to the good. You can lower yourself to bestiality. You can choose to assume an angelic spirituality. Man is self-determining. Man is placed at the center of the world. Man can choose to be angelic or bestial. The ultimate empowerment of the Renaissance man. Anyhow, moving along. One of the topics of profound interest to these folks was what I've called natural magic, or the magic inherent in nature, mainly astrology and alchemy. This is the magic implicit in natural forces. In their world, they're doing physics. They're looking at the natural forces of the observable universe. It assumed the universal interconnectedness of things and the belief that there were secret, hidden, esoteric explanations for the phenomena. If any of these people were suddenly transported forward so that they could read and appreciate Isaac Newton's thermodynamic laws and laws of gravity, they would have said, see, secret, hidden, esoteric explanations of the phenomena. They would have said, we were right all along. When science comes along, it actually fulfills the expectations that natural magic had for the human mind's capability or ability to solve the question of what makes it tick. Astrology and alchemy provided fertile ground for science, proto-science, pseudoscience, and out-and-out quackery. The model for everything. Astrology, up until the late 17th century, astrology was considered a science on a par with astronomy and meteorology. It attempts to identify macrocosmic patterns and predict human events. Several pioneering astronomers of the next century and a half, Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, Galileo, were unabashedly court astrologers. They did this with no shame. Alchemy, the traditional alchemy, turning base into noble metals, played a key role in the development of early modern medicine and chemistry by contributing to scientific lab techniques, methods, and terminology. Renaissance alchemy was heavily influenced by Hermeticism, and it actually left the realm of chemistry to go off into the occult framework concerned with the human soul, because the desired transformation, the alchemical ultimate dream, was that of human purification. And there's a woodcut of the Renaissance man confronting the stars in the upper right. And this is a period woodcut. And then, of course, these astrological tables and how they explain the interactions between the macrocosm of the universe and the microcosm of the human constitution. There are thousands of versions of these, from this point in time. I mentioned this book, The Splendor Solis, The Splendor of the Sun. It's a 16th century manuscript. I couldn't show the whole thing here. It has 22 elaborate artistic images, these plates depicting the symbolic nature of the alchemical process. And it's been attributed to the legendary teacher of Paracelsus, Salomon Trémouzin. The alchemical death and rebirth of the king using 7 flasks associated with the 7 planets that tell the story of the ultimate transformation of birds and animals into the queen and king, a symbolic transformation of the human soul. Here, if I can expand this a little bit. These are gorgeous. And like I said, there's 22. And here's the philosopher with a flask. Here's a hermaphrodite with egg, every element of which is symbolic of something or other. The red sun rising. And then on the right, I show, this is, from the Duc de Berry's Book of Hours, 15th century manuscript. And it's a depiction of the human body with the anatomical body of the individual person with the entire astrological universe, because the macrocosm determines the movement of the 4 humors in the medical jargon of the period. So the influence of the zodiacal stars on the human body, everything is connected. Astrology, medicine, and alchemy are aspects of a universal science. And the books and prints of the period sing of this in every which way. Anyhow, then the tradition of what we often think of, not natural magic, but occult magic, was rife in this period. What we normally associate with occult magic was popular in educated circles in this period, but it, on the downside, ran the risk of attracting the attention of religious authorities, which during the Reformation had very prickly ears. They were looking for any possible expression of heretical views, and would, by the end of the Renaissance period, lead to witch trials and the like. It was not uncommon for this kind of thing. Of course, if you were a court alchemist or court astrologer or court magician of one kind or another, you had a certain level of protection. And the people I'll mention here were of that class. They were significant teachers, authors, clients of powerful patrons. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa lives into the 16th century. He creates an esoteric alchemy fused with magic, astrology, and the Kabbalah in his book De Occulta Philosophia, which is translated almost into every vernacular European language. Here is a copy. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa of Nettesheim. So here is an English book on occult philosophy. And of course, his peer, the famous Paracelsus, the majestically named, I can never say Paracelsus without having to give his full name, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, pioneered the use of chemicals and minerals in medicine. Many have said of alchemy that it is for the making of gold and silver. For me, such is not the aim, but to consider only what virtue and power may lie in medicines. So not just plant-based medicines, but the actual minerals involved. He was actually trying to figure out and experiment with things that had impact on issues of health. The Hermetical view was that sickness and health depended on the inner harmony of man and nature. You got to get the microcosm realigned with the macrocosm, a balance of minerals in the body, a balance of humors and minerals. There was also, of course, ceremonial magic, the witches of Macbeth still are in the picture. With the advent of printing, the Renaissance witnessed an abundance of books known as grimoires. These were how-to manuals, very dangerous to publish these, They would usually be published in Venice or in Paris. But sometimes people had to get out of town and go to places like Holland to get stuff published. How-to manuals for spells, charms, and divinations, including instructions on how to create talismans and amulets, one of which I show here, the Clavicula Salomonis, the key of Solomon, attributed to King Solomon, described the invocation of magical operations to be performed by God. As long as you say the magical phrases correctly, you could bind God into the destined result. It was influenced by Kabbalah and by certain Arabic alchemists, because it was not just the Western world alone that was interested in this kind of thing. Now, Rosicrucianism is developed in the early 17th century. I'll still call it Renaissance, this source of the great theosophical tradition called the Rosy Cross. A manifesto, the Fama Fraternitatis Rosae Crucis, the fame of the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, was circulated among German occultists, promising the universal reformation of mankind through a science built on esoteric truths of the ancient past. Let's go back to Hermes and dig into all those esoteric truths. It presents the legend of a mystic philosopher called Father Brother CRC, who is later identified in a book written soon after, The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, CRC. Christian Rosenkreuz as Red Cross. There's a copy in the upper right of the Fama Fraternitatis. The documents are filled with highly cryptic explanations using the language of Kabbalah, Hermeticism, alchemy, and Christian mysticism. And Rosicrucianism, the reason I incorporated here, because there were all kinds of little groups springing up. I can only just touch on a couple, and Rosicrucianism, because it becomes the source and model of many early modern societies like the Freemasons, based on the idea of a secret brotherhood of initiates, alchemists and sages, who would transform science, religion, politics, and usher in a world of enlightenment. And so we get the great 18th century Zauberflöte, the magic flute of Mozart, rife with Masonic initiates and promises of secret wisdom that would lead to enlightenment. It became the rage of the age. From this little ditty by a man named Henry Adamson in the early 17th century. For what we do presage is not in gross, for we are brethren of the Rosy Cross. We have the Mason word and second sight. Things for to come we can foretell aright. And there's an image, there are many images of the Rosy Cross. And of course, the hieroglyphic monad, this image on the lower left, actually comes from the previous entry. It's the hieroglyphic monad being a single symbol of John Dee, combining elements. Some of these lines are from astrological and alchemical symbols. Elements of astrology, alchemy, mysticism, metaphysics was meant to symbolize the unity of creation. Meditating on the monad would lead to alchemical transformation and spiritual growth. And on the lower right, we have this woodcut, again with the Shekinah and the image of the name of God in the cloud, and the Collegium Fraternitatis. Here we are. This is from a woodcut from 1618, and it's the Temple of the Rosy Cross. And here it's a defensible fortress. It has wings, It has connections to the Godhead. It has angelic messengers. It has magical elements. And of course, it's a great machine in a world that simply loved the whole idea that great machines were going to be part of the future. Two more images from the 18th century. The circular one, the top left, is vitriol, an acronym for the alchemical maxim visita interiora terrae rectificando invenies occultum lapidem, which translates to visit the interior of the earth. By rectification, you will find the hidden stone. It encapsulates a transformative journey of self-discovery and inner purification, just like the magic flute, eh? By delving deep within oneself, confronting and refining one's inner darkness and impurities, one can uncover the profound spiritual truths and attain enlightenment. And this poster on the right is an image from the Rosicrucians of Sophia, the Jungfrau Sophia, the young woman Sophia, and with elements that are astrological and elements that are alchemical, and the whole rosy crucifixion is extant. Anyhow, Christian mysticism, the religion of the heart. The Reformation was an expression of several late medieval movements that anticipated Luther and called for the empowerment of the individual believer. The 12th century, these are people we talked about last time, the 12th century Waldensians, the poor men of Lyon, promoted a return to apostolic poverty. The Lollards followed John Wycliffe's disavowal of the Catholic clergy and the use of vernacular scriptures. Jan Hus criticized the wealth of the papacy. Devotional books had a vogue in the 15th century, the most famous being The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, a man who founded the so-called Devotio Moderna, modern devotion movement. Personal religion, personal God, you are empowered. If the Renaissance empowered humans in a humanist sense, the Reformation empowered them in a religious sense. So this wave of religiosity, which was manifest in this period, follows in the wake of the cult of Francis of Assisi, who becomes a kind of poster child for mystical elements all through the art of the period. I include a few of them here. Let me just show this little close-up. The Bellini on the left from 1480. This is in the Frick, by the way. It's St. Francis in the desert. And the Zurbaran of Francis in Meditation, they captured that kind of mystical, meditative, contemplative element of Francis. And the Caravaggio, on the other hand, has this very human Francis. And indeed, as Caravaggio does, I don't know how he gets away with it in his world, but he creates this image of human loving kindness and mysticism and homoeroticism all at the same time. So he had some kind of secret sauce that is new to all of us. And of course, I've shown this before in other classes, the Ghent altarpiece, again, focusing on a mystical element, the adoration of the mystic lamb from one of the panels with the human eyes that modern art critics have have noticed. And I show it the entire set of panels. And the mystic lamb, of course, is down here at the bottom, but there's got the Father, there's Adam and Eve, and choirs of angels, just this gorgeous, as I pointed out before, I've never been to Ghent, but it's something I would consider if only to get a chance to see this. And the whole idea of mystical contemplation, which was really developed by monks from the ancient world, but they receive high treatment in the late Middle Ages and in this Devotio Moderna movement of the 14th century. And I want to point out that one of the documents, The Cloud of Unknowing, it's an anonymous document, we don't know who to attribute it to, resonated a theme which had currency in both the Catholic and Protestant mystical traditions. The whole idea of emptying oneself, meditation, contemplation was about emptying oneself. For the first time, you lift your heart to God with stirrings of love, you will find only a darkness. And as it were, a cloud of unknowing. Whatever you do, this darkness and the cloud are between you and your God and hold you back from seeing him clearly by the light of understanding and your reason and from experiencing him in the sweetness of love in your feelings. And so prepare to remain in this darkness as long as you can, always begging for him you love. For if you are ever to feel or see him, it must always be in this cloud and this darkness. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul, for he can well be loved, but he cannot be thought. By love he can be grasped and held, but by thought neither grasped nor held. And therefore, though it may be good at times to think specifically of the kindness and excellence of God, and that this may be a light and a part of contemplation, all the same in the work of contemplation itself, it must be cast down and covered with a cloud of forgetting. And you must step above it stoutly but deftly with a devout and delightful stirring of love, and struggle to pierce that darkness above you and beat on that thick cloud of unknowing with a sharp dart of longing love, and do not give up, whatever happens. And the famous Bernini, Teresa d'Avila in Ecstasy at the Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. And on the next slide, I show it in situ because even the topic of mysticism in the Counter-Reformation would not be divorced from images of papal triumphalism. So you get this full glorified image of the power of the church with this mystical heart in the center of it. Anyhow, and on the final side, on the Protestant side of the mystical tradition of the period, we have the Anabaptists. These were the absolute radicals of the Protestant Reformation. Once Luther opens the floodgates with his critique of Catholic clergy and hierarchy and his three solas and his vernacular translation of the Bible, the movement to empower individual Christians quickly runs to radical extremes. So one of, if you will, the spokespeople for this radicalism, Thomas Müntzer of Münster, himself a mystic. You notice he dies in 1525, basically persecuted by armies under the direction of Luther, established a theocratic Christian commonwealth of absolute social equality and communal property. With the approval of Luther, the Münster uprising was savagely repressed in a bloody apocalypse. So Münster is filled with apocalyptic imagery and a mystical sense of the end is nigh, something that has always been on the edges of radical Protestantism for the centuries since then. Influenced by the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart, himself a Benedictine abbot, and his emphasis on the possibility of the direct experience of God. Get the priests away, take your Bible, read it, commune with God, achieve the inner light of the Holy Spirit. He argued that the Bible was not the sole spiritual authority, claiming that one could have direct communion with God through prayer, contemplation, and visions. So to expect visions and to receive them while in tribulation and suffering is in the true spirit of the apostles, the patriarchs, and the prophets. Hence, it is no wonder that Brother Fatted Pig, the Pope, and Brother Soft Life, that is Luther, reject them. But when one has not yet heard the clear word of God in the soul, one has to have visions. The road to salvation was wrought with pain, suffering, and sacrifice. What you must do is endure patiently and learn how God himself will root out your weeds, thistles, and thorns from the rich soil which is your heart. Otherwise, nothing good will grow there. Only the raging devil. Even if you have already devoured all the books of the Bible, you must still suffer the sharp edge of the plowshare. And so there we have it. Themes like mystical vision, themes like the secret of true religion that can come from ancient sages, intact across 17 centuries, 18 centuries of their development in the Hellenistic period in the Eastern Mediterranean. Same thing, same themes all the way down through to the Rosicrucians and the Masons and Christian mystics. And it never dies. Anyhow, I'm going to stop the share. There we go. I was missing the button. And I will unpin myself. And that's it. We are at the end of the line. Do you have any questions or observations? Thank you, Deb.
This is Barbara. Let me just say hello.
Hi.
Thank you. It was very interesting and informative. What percentage of the people of the times that you've been discussing were involved with these intense discussions, creations, imaginings, and where is all this thinking going on? How pervasive?
It depends on where we are and who we are. So, for instance, studies that were allegedly reserved only for initiates, like Kabbalah, would not have been very extensive, the audiences for them, until you get to movements like 17th, 18th century, I should say, Hasidism, when in certain Judaic circles, Kabbalah goes more mainstream. But the religious movements, whether it's Albigensianism in that part of France, would have reached down into lower social classes. Largely, whenever you're dealing with anything that is reserved for initiates or thought to be reserved for initiates, you're dealing with minorities, and you're dealing with people who think they're special.
Yes, and they must have been pretty bright.
Oh yeah. I mean, think about the languages you needed to get into some of the arcane stuff in the 15th century. The whole idea, we're so used to getting books in translation. The whole idea is, oh, I want to read Hermes Trismegistus. I guess I'm going to have to brush up on my Greek, on my first century Greek. That would have been, but that's what you would have done.
And travel to a distant library.
Yeah, exactly. Somehow get that library to you through a copy. You know, when you read the letters of there was in the early Italian Renaissance, the first great figure was the man who was a chancellor of the Florentine Republic named Coluccio Salutati. And he was also a scholar who had the first group of Greek students around him. And they found this amazing Greek teacher from Byzantium who Manuel Chrysoloras, who they brought to Florence. This is in the 1380s and 1390s. It was pre-Ficino and pre the council. And it didn't become mainstream then. But there was a group of young literate scribes whose work was usually working for the Pope. The papal library had a big scribal group. And these guys traded letters all the time about, has anybody stumbled across a copy of this or a copy of that? And they would make trips on their summer vacation, so to speak. They would make trips up to Germany and they would talk their way into the library at abbeys like Boiron in Germany, where they would sit and using their papal credentials, the only way they get in, saying, you know, I'm on a special mission from the Pope to look up stuff in your library. And knowing that they wouldn't be able to take the books away with them, they would sit in these libraries sometimes and copy down what was in manuscripts, go back for days and hours and weeks and sneak back and then write letters to their buddies back in Rome or in Florence or wherever in Venice and say, I got my hand, you won't believe what I got my hands on. You know, I found this by Cicero, you know, and these stupid monks, they're uneducated, they have no idea what's in their own library. Several books thought to be lost in from the ancient world were found this way. And then when printing came out, it was such a revolution that, and you had people in England, for instance, I happen to know of some people who in England at that point who had connections to printers in Venice saying, here, I'm sending you 50 English pounds, which is a lot of money. Get me, here's a list of names. You can get me any of this stuff. Get me this stuff. If you can print, if you know you're coming out, and this is the way printers work, by the way, in those first couple of generations, they would say, I'm thinking of doing an edition of, I don't know, Catullus's poetry. And or I'm thinking of doing an edition of Ptolemy's Almagest or something. And I'm going to do an edition of 100, a print edition of 100. To make it worth my while, will you be one of the subscribers? Meaning it's going to cost you each X amount of money. And if I can raise, it's as if somebody says, I need to raise 50 grand right now to produce 50 copies of something. And if you all step in for $1,000 a piece, I promise to get you a copy. And it won't be around until next year, and this is the way early publishing, until there was a readership, this is the way publishing worked. So you either went, as you point out, you either went someplace to find the book, or somebody found it for you, one of these, Poggio Bracciolini, one of these guys who went rummaging through monasteries all over the continent, and discovered amazing things. And you knew them, you got your hands on stuff. It was an exciting time.
Yeah, thank you.
We disparage things now. We take too much advantage of, shall I read the Russian novelists again? It's too easy. Anyhow, this was fun. If I think of another topic, I'll create another class.
Well, thank you, Lou. This was
That would be great.
wonderful.
Thank you, Lou.
Session.
Okay, gang.
Yeah.
So worthwhile. Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much.
Yes, thank you.